Welcome back to session 2 of our discussing literature and discipleship. And this week, is focusing on finding books that spark curiosity, teach literacy, and reinforce biblical values. So you were to select books that align with your child's interests and faith development and introduce faith-based picture books, biographies of Christian heroes, or moral-based stories, and then share a book title that impacted your child and a conversation it sparked with the hashtag #LitDisciples. So I hope you'll do that this week. And even if you don't get it done this week, just whenever you get to it, because I know some of these challenges may take more than a week. It's not like you're on a deadline. Just post those and we'll watch for those. And if you add the hashtag Terry Hullard Brown, I'll see it even easier. So, feel free to do that as well. What we want to talk about today are what books do we want to look at that might help teach faith, but at the same time that gives us the different aspects of analyzing literature that our children need to learn, with the literary devices, literary elements, and all of those things. We want to find good literature that is usable for our classroom as well as usable for our teaching discipleship. And definitely, we want books that spark curiosity. I'm going to share a few books with you today that we've done because of my kids' interests. We've looked at books that were in those categories and then found ones that were good for teaching biblical truth, good for teaching life skills, and just good reading. We want to teach our children to recognize God's truth in every story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So today I'm going to mostly focus on fiction writing that we read because that's mostly what we read in our literature classes. However, I'm hoping to compile a list of nonfiction that is appropriate for teens and preteens. I hope to have those lists together and available for you in the show notes, but if not, they will be coming soon. So let's dig in. I'm going to share my screen. I went to Amazon, could have gone to Goodreads or wherever to find the different books I'm wanting to talk about. But I want to give you one example where we used my daughter's interest. Like I said in the last episode, she loves dragons, she loves wolves, she loves animals of all kinds. And so we've always centered our reading around books that are on those topics. She loves mythical creatures, she loves drawing them. And so we've just gone with it and tried to find books that were really good. And so she's read the Aragon series, which is a dragon series. She's read some other dragon series. There's some that are Christian based that are really quite good, and she's really enjoyed those. And so if your kids are into dragons, we can give you a dragon list from young readers through adult readers that are really pretty good. There are some that are really dark and awful, and we've stayed away from those. But there are some amazing Christian writers who have written about dragons, including yours truly. I've written Drandar the Dragon Knight, which is a chapter book for upper elementary middle schoolers, especially if your middle schoolers are struggling readers. This would be a good book to introduce. But I want to show you, this is A Wolf Story by James Byron Huggins. He is a Christian writer, and he has quite a few books out, and some of them look really scary. I haven't read them all, but I have read this one. And this story is amazing. Now, he tends to reuse phrases, and that part bugs me as a writer when I read his writing. So as far as teaching writing skills, actually you can teach a little bit of what not to do. It's amazing when you're writing, and you can help your children recognize this in their essays. And this book actually would be good for teaching that. If you have a unique phrase that kind of stands out, if you use it twice in an essay, your reader perceives that as redundant. And in this book, he uses some great expressions, and I'm like, I don't even know what other expression he could have used, but because it was such a unique expression and he uses it 2 or 3 times in the whole novel, it still stood out as repetitive. And so we need to watch that. If it's a very unique expression, we can really, in an essay, only use it once. In a book, we still have to be careful. And so that's something with James Byron Huggins that I critique him on, because I think he uses such unique descriptors, but then to reuse them again 2 and 3 times in the book, it just stands out and it's distracting. And so that's something you can talk about as far as writing ability and something to watch out for when you're teaching your children how to write. But this story is so good. Here in the description, this tale of savage conflict and enduring faith tells of a wolf's passion to overcome evil and the battle for victory in the deep woods. The encroaching powers of the Dark Council call for courage and determination as never before among the followers of the Lightmaker. Can they stand firm? This book is total fantasy with a definite Christian theme, but I wept as I read this book. I mean, I don't get that emotional usually when I'm reading, and I was just a mess reading it. It is so powerful, and I highly recommend this for your middle school through high school readers. If they're into wolves or animal stories, allegories, those kinds of stories, this one is amazing. And again, we can always use any negative to teach our children how not to write. I'll give you another example of a negative. Okay, the book, The Lord of the Flies. This is a classic that almost every school has our children reading. It's a powerful, powerful story. If you've ever read the book, it's very powerful. The movie is gut-wrenching, but I hate that story. When I was in high school and we had to read it, I hated it because it deals with the selfish, sinful part of man. It is a textbook on the heart of man. And when I say man, I mean mankind, people. And this book is so hard to read. And I really caution you as a parent, you've probably read it in your literature classes, but if our children are really sensitive children, I wouldn't have them read it till high school, if at all, because it is such a gut-wrenching book. But it's a powerful book, and it opens up some very important conversations about how power corrupts, about selfishness, about the evil intentions and desires of the human heart, how our hearts are deceitful, and also a mob mentality and how it can turn us into savages when we think we're being sophisticated or civilized. So, very powerful book. Lots of amazing conversations we can have from that book, but it is a hard one to read. And if your child is super sensitive, of course, consider what you should do. Okay, so let's look at some others that we can talk about here. I'll come back to some other principles behind all of this, but I want to talk about some real-time literature books you may be reading in your homeschool, or your child, even if they're not in homeschool, may be reading in their classes at school. So let's talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne. We all know The Scarlet Letter. You've probably read it in school. I highly recommend reading it. I think it's a good book. And I think reading Nathaniel Hawthorne is good for us because we're still dealing with older language, but not quite Shakespeare. Your children are going to have to grapple with the language to get the story. And that's so important. I taught some students here in the States when we were home for about 1.5 years, and I had them read The Scarlet Letter. I had them read The Robe and other stories that were written in an older English, like from the 1800s, early 1900s. So it wasn't super old. It was just old enough that they struggled with it. And they had not been exposed to enough of this kind of writing to be able to navigate this. One book they read, they didn't understand anything they were reading. And so Shakespeare, you can imagine, would be even harder to introduce to this kind of a group of children who are really struggling. So we want to start when they're in middle school, introducing some of these more difficult texts that are from the 1800s so that they're used to a little bit older English and can start grappling with the language. I think it is important to introduce, and Nathaniel Hawthorne is a good example because he has so many short stories. His short stories are available online. You can get those without even paying anything. As far as his short stories, there's The Minister's Black Veil, which is an intriguing story. about where we start getting suspicious or paranoid. It's a lesson in paranoia, honestly, but it's just a really interesting story. His short stories are very interesting. Another one that's a really weird story is The Birthmark. My goodness, if you want to talk about what makes a marriage, this one has a lot of conversations in it that could be sparked from that. Expectations, perfectionism, egotism, and pride. My goodness, so much. And then also submission and what submission means. This story has so much you can talk about as far as foreshadowing and literary devices. It has those abundantly in it. Dr. Heidegger's experiment, that's one of my favorites because it shows us how we think we've matured, we think we've changed, but given the right circumstances, we revert back to our most base personality of who we really are. It talks about a sin nature. We could talk about, um, even talking about self-image and the pursuit of perfection in youth and all of that, wishing we could go back and change something, regrets from the past. We could talk about all these kinds of things in this story. So those are 3 of his short stories that I think are so good to talk about. Rappaccini's Daughter's another one. Those are the ones, as far as his short stories, that I would consider starting with in middle school. Then when you get into like 10th grade, introducing The Scarlet Letter, or 11th grade, depending when you're doing American literature. We did it in 11th grade at my schools, but your curriculum may do it in 10th grade, but it's usually 10th or 11th grade. Then we have Mark Twain. Now, we all know Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, and I think those are fantastic. I love Huck Finn because of the turning point in that book is so powerful. The one line where Huck realizes that Jim is human, and you see how prejudice and stereotypes dehumanize people. And we're seeing that happen right now in our culture everywhere because people are making race such a thing again, to a point that they've belittled people to just the color of our skin. And whatever color your skin is, they think you are that stereotype. And it has caused such division in our country and is such a mess. And we have got to teach our children better. So in this story, when Huck realizes that Jim is human, just like him, is so, so powerful. We have these themes in this literature, but have you ever read his other stories? Now, the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is just a weird story. It's got time travel and all that. I think he used it to vent. He wanted to talk about his beliefs and his take on society and its ills. It's a real work of satire, but it's just an interesting story. But if you don't know about Mark Twain, or about his real life, he married a Connecticut Yankee. His family had owned slaves. He was from the South, and he met this girl and married her, and she opened his eyes to the truth that these were people and that slavery was wrong. And so he changed his whole life view because of her influence in his life. It's really interesting. It comes through in a lot of his work. And then you'll see a change in his literature. He loses his daughter and his wife to TB, or one of those diseases that was rampant during that era. And he's not the same after that. We see that with C.S. Lewis as well. The grief that these men went through at the loss of their wives is visible in their writing. Again, when we're doing literary analysis with our children and teaching them, that's one of the things we have them recognize. We always, like I said, it's mind reading. We're trying to read the mind of the author. What are they going through? What are they wanting us to understand? What themes and topics and subjects are they talking about? So when we help our children analyze literature, we're going to see that shift in Mark Twain's writing when he loses his wife, and they can start to understand that. He has short stories and essays. His essays are really good. He was quite a man of wit, and he really was a thinker. His emotions were not hidden. His opinions were not hidden. And you can see those in his story and what he's going through and what he's thinking of. The Diaries of Adam and Eve. I think are just the most fun to read. And you see that most of these you can get on Kindle for free or almost free, and they are very inexpensive. But the Diaries of Adam and Eve will crack you up. And for your older kids, of course, they need to know what the Bible really says and recognize that this is satire, this is total fiction, and not get it confused with the real Bible. But it is such a funny take on men and women and our personalities and how God created us. I really enjoyed reading that. And we read that with my 7th graders, and they seem to enjoy it too. It also opened up the opportunity for me to share what the Bible really says about creation and Adam and Eve and all of that. But it was just a lot of fun. And then he has his short stories, the celebrated jumping frog story from Calaveras County, and he has so many others. On the Decay of the Art of Lying, A Tramp Abroad, but you need to pre-read his stories before you present them to your children. And that's true with most of the things we read, because some of them are just interesting. But Huck Finn, Mark Twain, and Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, those are classics that we're reading in most schools. But short stories, the satire, and I highly recommend the Diaries of Adam and Eve. He has one story that's completely unacceptable and no one should read. I ran across it. I had no idea he had written that in a very dark time in his life. And there's some others that are really dark, really not ones I would want my children to read. So be aware of that. If you have a question about one, I'm glad to share, if I've read it, what my take is on it. This is another situation where language comes into play. And so as from a literature standpoint, our children are reading words that are unacceptable in our culture today, which is why Mark Twain and Huck Finn have been banned many times from schools, because it does have bad language in it. But we need to help our children learn a very important skill, and that is to analyze literature from the lens of the era in which it was written. During the era that Mark Twain wrote these stories, this was the way people talked. So that's Mark Twain and how we can bring important conversations into our discussions with our kids. Okay, let's look at another one. Charles Dickens. He's another favorite in the literature classes. He has so many good books, and he has so many boring books. Let's just be honest. I always tell my students, Dickens wrote during a time, most of his stories were written as series in a magazine, and he was paid by the word. So that is why his writing is so wordy. When they understand that, it helps a little bit. It also helps us then to talk to our students about their writing and not being overly wordy. Say something succinctly and clearly, using the best words possible. Appropriate words, we want them to not get out the thesaurus and just go to town. We want them to use wisdom in what words they choose so that they can clearly communicate in their writing. We can learn from Dickens in that way. But of course, we have the French Revolution in A Tale of Two Cities. So if you're talking about that in your history class, then reading the novel is kind of a good way to talk about that. We've got David Copperfield, of course, and Great Expectations, Oliver Twist. I don't like a lot of the novels we read in literature. I don't like Great Expectations. And it's really a shorter story, actually. It's not even a novel. And yet it lends itself to some great conversations. And I do love the plot twists in the story, I have to say. That part is really good. The way Dickens weaves that story and connects everything together. But it's just such a depressing story of abuse and, just so much, so much. My favorite of his is Christmas Carol. I think it's brilliant. And of course, it changed our whole culture. He is a classic writer. He is one that our children will be exposed to and expected to read in their literature classes. And then let's see, Alexander Dumas wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, Three Musketeers. Those are some powerful novels. With the Three Musketeers, we're talking about loyalty and integrity and all of that comes into that story. All these classic writers, their stories have themes going through them that are universal. That's why they're classics. So we can bring in biblical themes as we're talking about these stories. Now, one of my favorites to talk about doing this is Othello from Shakespeare. And when we look at Shakespeare, there are so many good stories to talk about and themes to talk about. We've got Romeo and Juliet. I have a shirt that says, I think they could have handled the situation better, but it opens up the talk about suicide. It opens up a talk about young love and how it can be impulsive, and that's not always good. When you've got so many of Shakespeare's plays deal with prejudice, racial tensions, Othello included. But I love to talk about Othello, not just for the racial issues that are introduced in this story. I like it too because it shows that the race issues are not just American. A lot of people would like to make us think that we were the only people who were ever prejudiced, and it is not true. Every country on earth has had prejudice against people who look different, who have different color skin, who are from a different culture. You see that in the Bible. You see that in Shakespeare. You see it in everything. It is everywhere. We experienced it when we were in Taiwan. In their view, Chinese people are the smartest, most perfect people, and everyone else is less than. And they were very prejudiced when we first moved there, very prejudiced against Africans, African Americans, dark-skinned people. In fact, so much so, many of the young women were bleaching their skin because they wanted to be as white as possible. But even with my students felt they were smarter than the American teachers who taught them, because the Chinese are smarter than the white people of America. And that was just the attitude, an ethnocentric attitude, a prejudice attitude that we had to deal with. And it just is the way it is. And so when they become Christians, when we get to work together and know each other, of course, prejudice starts to dwindle and it gets better. But it was pretty bad when we first moved there. They're very prejudiced against people with any kind of birth defect, typically in their culture. And this is a stereotype of the culture, but it is what we saw, what we experienced. It was like one teacher came in and I can't remember if he had lost his hand or had a crippled hand or whatever. And they didn't even want to consider hiring him because that defect, and he was also black, that defect and his color of his skin automatically in their minds meant he was not as smart. Even though he was educated, had a degree, and had been a teacher, it was shocking to him how prejudiced they were, and sad. Cultures everywhere have this. And the difference I saw personally in Taiwan, the difference was when they met Christ, and the change took place in their hearts and minds, and it was just different. Not everybody, some people still held on to prejudice, but many people whose lives were changed by Jesus also began to stop being so prejudiced. So that was very interesting to me to see that firsthand and to live through that. But anyway, let's talk about Othello. This is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, and it is not one commonly taught in our curriculum, but I always added it. We would do Macbeth or Hamlet, whichever your book requests. And then, of course, you had Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar. Those are pretty common in most literature plans for children. In fact, usually in about 8th grade, you start with the Crispin poem, and then you go into either Julius Caesar or Romeo and Juliet, and then you have the other one the next year till you get to Macbeth for senior year, or Hamlet. Many people also do Much Ado About Nothing. That's a really good one. Or A Midsummer Night's Dream. We did A Midsummer Night's Dream at our Christian school, but we adapted it. We left out the sexual connotation that was in it. It is one of his comedies that is popular. There's sex in a lot of his stories, but I prefer Much Ado About Nothing personally. Anyway, Othello, like I said, is one of my favorites. If you've never read it, it's not very long. It does deal with racial It does deal with racial tensions between the Italians and the exotic Moor, Othello. And so he is dark-skinned and he marries Desdemona. Her family is outraged that she has married this dark-colored skinned man. But he is a noble man. He's a man of integrity for most of the story. They lob these racial slurs at him that are in the story, and he just goes with it. He just doesn't let it get him. Well, then we introduce the best villain Shakespeare ever wrote, I think, and that is Iago. Iago is evil, and he is so good at being evil. This is where the conversations begin to open up, if we take the time to really talk about it after we've read the story. I love it in the movie with Fishburne being Othello, and I forget the guy's name who is Iago, but he looks into the camera. He breaks that fourth wall and talks to the audience, and it is so well done in the movie. It's my favorite one to watch. But in the story, he's just an evil, evil man, and he tells you his schemes. You know, this is where we have that irony where we know what's going on. Iago knows what's going on, but the other characters are clueless. And he is basically manipulating everything. And he's especially manipulating Othello and Desdemona's relationship. And what that opens up in the conversation is when you know a person and you know who they are, and someone comes along and shares gossip about them, what should our response be? And according to scripture, our response should be to reject the gossip, that we don't listen to gossip, that we don't partake in gossip, that it is a sin. And I always tell my students and my church members, gossip is a cancer that will spread rapidly and kill the fellowship. And that's exactly what we see happen in Othello, because Iago spreads gossip that he made up, that is untrue, and he even manipulates the situation to make it appear true. Othello drops everything he believed about his wife and believes the lie. And when he believes the lie, what happens? Destruction. When we believe Satan's lies, what happens in our lives? Destruction. He is trying to kill, to steal, and to destroy everything that God has. Satan is a liar, and everything he says is a lie or a half-truth. There's never a full truth. It's always bending the truth, giving it a spin, or just out and out lying. And we see this in Othello, and we can talk about these important lessons when we read Othello. They will come up naturally as you read it. Enjoy the story, watch the movie. With Shakespeare, I fully believe in watching the plays because they are plays, and it's hard to just read it. Yes, I think we should, but then to watch the play performed brings it to life. These were meant to be acted, not read. So this is one time where I say, let your children watch the movies and preview them, make sure they're acceptable. We would, during the time I was teaching Shakespeare, one of my schools I taught in, they had an ESL program because it was in Taiwan. And so these students had to get their language level to the right level first, and then they could delve into the literature. And so when I got them, some of them had never read any Shakespeare. They were seniors, so they needed this foundation. So we did what I called Shakespeare Palooza. And for a month, we would meet at lunchtime and watch Shakespeare movies and talk about the different plays. And so they were exposed to almost all of his plays during that month. It was so much fun. And we watched the movies, and we watched some of the movies that are derived from the Shakespeare plays, like Lion King, for one, is Hamlet. And we have Taming of the Shrew. There's a more modern take on it, and I can't think of the name of that one right now, but there's several movies that were made from the premise of a Shakespeare play set in a modern setting. Othello, you have O, is a movie that was made about Othello, but I always prefer the original text and watching an original movie, usually by the Royal Shakespeare Company. If you can get their videos, they're really, really good. We watched the Romeo and Juliet version with DiCaprio. I didn't like it. I thought it was kind of eh. But then we watched another one that had been made during that same time period that was the original setting, the original text, and was done beautifully. Really, really well done. So I think that it's really good to see the play in its original context with its original language, and then look at some of the adaptations. I love the ones that Patrick Stewart is in. because I think he's such a phenomenal Shakespearean actor. I also liked him in Star Trek. But anyway, um, I just think this is such a worthwhile story to introduce to your children in their junior, senior year. I say junior because even though you're probably doing American Lit, when you talk about Mark Twain and dealing with racial prejudice, this is just along that same theme. So you could introduce it while you're doing To Kill a Mockingbird and Huckleberry Finn, and then to bring in Othello and show that prejudice isn't just an American disease. It's a human disease. We all struggle with our own prejudices and how it can be so destructive and how gossip can be so destructive. And then talk about how when you know someone and you trust someone that you can rely on that. But when someone has shown you that they are untrustworthy, you need to believe that as well. And use discernment, use wisdom when we are giving our hearts to people, when we are committing to people. The Bible says don't be unequally yoked with one another, even in a business deal or a business setting, to have discernment and wisdom in those situations. So this story just lends itself to a lot of those conversations. I didn't mean to spend so much time on that one, but you can tell it is one of my favorites to talk about. So let's go on to some other topics. Agatha Christie. I like mysteries. Agatha Christie, And Then There Were None. This one we can talk about the weight of guilt and shame and how God wants to forgive and restore, but we can still be ruled by our own guilt if we don't trust in the forgiveness that God gives us, if we don't trust in his grace and his mercy. If we do, And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, and the power of shame and guilt in our lives and the need for grace and forgiveness. If you want to read a nonfiction book, or maybe you read it and then talk about it with your kids, a really powerful one is Shame and Grace by Lewis Smedes. And it has been a life-changing book for both me and my husband, because we can be Christians for a long time before we really grasp the power of grace and fully understand forgiveness. And then C.S. Lewis has a really interesting essay on forgiveness. It's very short. It's just a real short essay. And I think that doing a combination of those stories together and using that as a theme in your literature would just be really interesting with your kids, to really hammer home what it means to experience God's grace and his mercy, and to understand what it means to forgive others and why it's so important. That would be a powerful unit for literature on shame and grace and forgiveness and God's mercy toward us. And it could be a really powerful. So that would be something I would recommend. Okay. And then we have one of my favorite writers, C.S. Lewis. I've talked about him many times. Now, I do understand that his theology was a little odd. And so other than Narnia, I don't usually introduce C.S. Lewis until high school because his writing is so deep and makes us think. Another writer I enjoy reading is Chesterton. Now, I do not agree with their theology. In fact, Chesterton really influenced C.S. Lewis. Just because I disagree with part of what they believe, they make me think. And I love that. And I love the way they turn a phrase that makes me think of it a little differently than I might have thought of it before. That doesn't mean that I think all their theology is right. In fact, I like reading Tim Keller. Same thing. I don't agree with his theology 100%. But I gain something by reading their books. And so we have to gauge with our children where they are. Are they critical thinkers? Are they able to read books that introduce theology that is different from the Bible or different from the way we understand the Bible? And say, wrestle with it and say, what's wrong here? Why do I disagree with this? By the way, Till We Have Faces is supposedly one of his best works. And I have that one. I've read part of it. I haven't finished it. My son has read it and thought it was really good. Others have read it and highly recommend it. But The Great Divorce, there's so much in this book. And it is a weird, weird book. It's just really got some weird stuff in there. But I love it that when they're walking in heaven, the grass is painful because it's like metal shards to those who are not yet changed to their heavenly bodies, to their eternal bodies, and also those who aren't saved. To those who aren't saved, heaven is pain, and that's because they've rejected God. And C.S. Lewis is making a really interesting statement here, and he wrote this whole book as a response to a poem that was written by one of the poets that starts with B. Burns. I think that's who wrote it. But anyway, you'll see the little beginning of the poem is in the front of the book. The Great Divorce is a response to that poem because C.S. Lewis totally disagreed with that poem. And in the poem, it's talking about a marriage between good and evil, kind of. And he's like, no, it's a great divorce. And so he's showing that a person who has rejected Christ, even if they went to heaven, it would be hell to them. I think that's so interesting, such an interesting take. When we talk about Narnia, I love the Narnia books. There's so much to glean from them, and they're just good stories. But he introduces some of the fables and garbage, I guess, that's out there where there's, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a story about Lilith, who was supposedly Adam's first wife, and she was a demon, and it's just a weird story. And of course, is not biblical, is not true. And he included that in one of the Narnia. I don't know why he included that, except that Narnia is kind of fantasy and has that element to it with the different characters and creatures. But why he would talk about Lilith, I don't know. There are people who believe it was a true story and that she was real and that it's all about oppressing women and all this kind of stuff. It's ridiculous. If you read the story, it's ridiculous. And so anyway, like I said, we need to read with critical eyes and critical thinking, even Narnia by C.S. Lewis. But he's one of my favorite writers because he makes me think. Chesterton is the same way. He makes me think. So when they're old enough, when they're ready, this is really good. And the reason I think it's so important is because I have seen so many people go to college, and in a liberal arts education, you have to take philosophy. Or if you're becoming a teacher, you have to take the philosophy of education. And in these philosophy classes, you are reading Gnosticism, humanism, all these different ideas. And of course, we're bombarded by ideas on the web now anyway. Our children need to be ready to look at ideas critically and discern truth. We've got to give them that ability more than any other generation. It's always been necessary, but it's really necessary now. If we can introduce weird theology, weird ideas, and other philosophies, man-made philosophies to our children and have them look at them critically, it's a powerful tool. And I highly recommend, even in picture book age, that we start doing this. There's a couple books from Foundation Worldview that are picture books you can read, and one is called What is Truth? And the second one is Are My Emotions True? Or something like that. It's talking about judging truth by our emotions and how that's not reliable. They're really good, really well done books. And of course, they have curriculum we can use for teaching apologetics to our kids from even the age of 4 and up. So this is really good to use in, even if you're not homeschooling, to do this as a lesson at home, weekly Bible study time with your kids to teach them good apologetics. And there are some great books out there for older kids as well. Helping our kids to think critically is just vital. Even if they haven't accepted Christ yet, they still need to be critical thinkers. So we need to help them do that. We have that opportunity through our literature classes to really teach our kids and encourage and equip them to be able to think critically, to analyze literature critically, and to look at truth critically. So I highly recommend doing that. And I hope I've given you a few books, a few ideas, a few ways that you can approach literature and help your kids to discern God's truth, to recognize God's truth woven into the stories. With my little chapter book on Drandar, the Dragon Knight, even though we're not talking about him being a Christian, we're not talking about God in that story, the message is there. Your child will most likely pick up God's truth woven through the story, the importance of perseverance, the importance of believing truth and rejecting the lies of the enemy. That's in the story, woven in there. And then when we do the Bible study, we bring those forward to us as humans following Christ and what that means for us. And so as we are reading whatever we're reading from picture book on up, when our children can see God's truth in what they're reading, they can glean these lessons from the stories. The Holy Spirit working in them can bring Bible verses back to their memory that they've memorized as they're reading these stories. And it can help them to be stronger in their faith and in their foundation of God's word. So I want to encourage you to continue to dig in and have your children tell you what they see, what truths they see in the literature that you're reading. It is fun, it is powerful, and it's amazing to see how their little minds are working. I guess I shouldn't say little minds if they're in high school, but if they're little guys, how their minds are working and what they are gleaning from what they're reading. We can also do that with Bible stories. As we're reading Bible stories together, what can we learn from Esther? I love to do character studies of Bible characters and dig into what they are teaching us through their testimony, through their experience with God, and how we should emulate them or use them as a cautionary tool as we understand the things that God is trying to teach us through each story that He's included in His Word, what we need to learn, what we need to glean, and how we need to live our lives. So let's glean that biblical truth, and whether we're reading fiction or nonfiction, use discernment, use critical thinking, and not just buy into everything we're reading. There are some great essays that many schools will introduce. One of those actually talks about Lilith, now that I think about it. But to look at it critically and say, is this argument right? Why does this argument carry such weight? We want to talk about those kinds of things. Is it real truth, or are they just good at spinning a truth? We need to be able to do that. You can also look at, there's a guy who does a podcast on YouTube, and there's a podcast on YouTube called Wise Disciple. And the guy who leads it, he was a pastor. He's also been a teacher, and he was a debate teacher. And so he analyzes what people say on social media under the lens of truth and critical thinking. And so he's a good guy to watch, to learn how to analyze things critically. And you might consider watching some of his programs with your kids as well. So that's another resource. Bible thinker Mike Winger is also another guy that's good to watch. He has some good things to say. I also listen to Allie Beth Stuckey and Melissa Doherty and Alyssa Childers. I really like theirs. All of these, and Josh McDowell, all of these guys and gals who share are really teaching us how to think critically, how to look at truth and see what is truth and should we believe it or reject it. And I taught this to my kids really at a young age because, like I said, my daughter loves dragons. Well, she loves dinosaurs. And when she was little, she was totally into dinosaurs. Both of my kids, when I had just the two, now I have four, but the first two were totally into science. And so we would find these great books for kids. Well, all of them come from an evolutionary standpoint, unless you get them from Answers in Genesis. They almost all promote an evolution stance. They come from that theory and that belief system. And so I had to teach my kids to think critically from day one, practically. And we would talk about evolution, and we would talk about creation. We would talk about what the Bible says and what the science actually shows and how it supports whichever perspective you're coming from. The evidence supports your view because you interpret it from your worldview. And so we have the same evidence. It's how we interpret it that makes the difference. And that's why an evolutionist can be absolutely certain they know the truth, and a creationist can be absolutely certain they know the truth, and they're looking at the same fossil and the same evidence. So to teach our children that is really vital and powerful. And I've watched my kids be able to watch things on the science TV shows and read these science books and not have their faith shaken at all, because they know the truth and they hold on to the truth, and they just are like, well, that's ridiculous when they see something so silly. And they recognize when an artist has taken a little too much license in the way they've drawn a picture, and when a scientist has taken too much license in drawing his conclusions when the evidence is not really there. This is what we need to give our children. It is a gift. Like most of the things we're talking about, these are gifts we are giving our children, and they are gifts that will matter for a lifetime and that can affect their whole future. So I hope you are encouraged. I hope this gives you some ideas. If you have a book that you're reading with your child and you're like, I don't know how to approach this, feel free to ask questions. I will give you what I can. If I know the book, I will share with you my own thoughts. I will share with you what I would do with a lesson. I'm happy to do that. Just ask. And you can also join our discipleship parenting groups. We have 2 of them. They are, one meets once a month, one meets twice a month on Zoom. And it is where we address your specific questions and strategize ideas for how to best disciple our kids, discipline, and lead our children in our home, and hopefully make our homeschools a really positive and exciting part of our lives. So, and you don't have to be a homeschooler to join this group. Don't misunderstand me, but I just know there are a lot of homeschoolers who follow me and what I'm doing. I'm an educator. I just think we have so many opportunities to really educate our children well. Even if we don't homeschool, we can be involved and we can be a part, and we need to put our children first and recognize how we can help them be successful. God bless you, and I look forward to talking to you in the next episode as we dig into literature as discipleship.